Today, we want to think beyond those structures. The first way to do it, of course, in overthrowing that kind of hierarchy, is to reinscribe one term over against the term that has held traditional dominance. To take an example here on television. One thinks television is different from the real world. And of course, you think in terms of binary oppositions, that there is a difference between the real world and television, normally decided by you in favor of the real world. To deconstruct this opposition, I would simply reverse that hierarchy and insert television as the term with temporal and logical priority. Now, what does that mean in the practical sense? Well, in discussing something as abstract as a binary opposition of television and the real world, there has to be some kind of a practical use to disrupting this opposition. What if we were then to think American culture not as something limited simply within geographic bounds, but to think American culture not as real, but as television? In fact, a television culture, a culture that is organized and determined by a mass of people huddled around the video hearth. Television does more than simply provide the center of today's postmodern home. Television provides you with your moral and ethical ideals given to you in those neat 30-minute packages of a sitcom. Television provides you with your flow of information, your information exchange. You have the news morning, noon, and night, 24 hours a day indeed, on CNN. So you have your information and your morality. But more than that, television provides you with your art. Not only this, but television programs on arts and entertainment, on the Disney Channel, on the movie channels. In fact, one can have one's aesthetic gratification there in the world of television just as one can in the real world, without ever leaving the comfort of the television hearth. In this way, reversing that opposition between television and the real world, you can see how television has come, in one sense, to supplant what we call the real world. Our knowledge of the real world comes to us from no other place than television. This is the place where deconstruction would begin, in simply taking that opposition and strategically, in a single moment, reversing it. Of course, that simply isn't enough, because it still maintains a structuralism, a structural hierarchy of two terms. Deconstruction always wants you to ask, what is there more than this? What grounds that opposition? What is the condition of the possibility of thinking the opposition of television and the real world? This is a difficult problem. To take the opposition and reverse it is a necessary and simple first step, but at the same time, it has to be accompanied by a further move, that one takes television and the real and reinscribes those two terms in an altogether different field. Well, first of all, we have to know in what field do we make the opposition the real and television. Of course, this is very much a practical opposition. It's an opposition based in terms of another opposition between illusion and reality, where the real, of course, the world of our practical experience, is reality, and the world of television, the ideal, is the world of illusion. So then, reinscribing television and the real in a hierarchy governed, in one sense, by our feelings of illusion, and in fact our very idea of what truth is, truth with a capital T, where the real is true and television so obviously is false and illusory. In reinscribing that opposition there, we're allowed to think truth as the ground of that opposition, and in turn, truth in an entirely different manner. Can we have a truth, in fact, without the illusions provided us by television? I don't think so. I think we have truth because we have the illusion of television first, as a prior term, to give us something to distinguish everything else from. In one sense, that's a good theoretical example of how deconstruction can work. But it tells you more about deconstruction as a practice for criticizing, analyzing, and investigating an art form such as television, more than it tells you about deconstruction itself as art. Can a philosophical concept be art? This is difficult. Of course, we've never thought of philosophical concepts in that way before. But the very idea that we've never thought of philosophy in that way before makes this a challenging, productive, and rebellious move to make, to consider deconstruction not philosophy, but somehow as art. In fact, deconstruction can only approach art only to the extent that itself is art, that it is itself involved somehow in the aesthetic. Of course, the involvement in the aesthetic is very difficult to quantify. That one does not want to reduce philosophy to deconstruction, to aesthetics, which in turn makes it philosophy. We're stuck in a kind of hermeneutic circle. The way that allows us to step outside of that is through simply the works of art. The four works of art behind me, the television monitors, the field against which they assert themselves as objects, that background against which they stand out as existence. In one sense, deconstruction provides another background, not to allow the televisions to sink into, so that they somehow swim in the flux of deconstruction as an aesthetic idea, but rather in allowing the televisions to participate in this idea of deconstruction, it allows an altogether new reading of television.